The apartment smelled of damp wood and old coffee, a forgotten refuge for a man who had seen too much. Daniel flipped through the dusty boxes he had shoved into the corner after the Black Vulture's raid, a raid that had cost so many lives, too many. His fingers brushed over photographs of that night, over journals filled with names, over maps inked with routes and warnings. Every memory clawed at him. And then, a faint sound, a shuffle, a sniff, a careful, deliberate step. Shadow, limping but alive, emerged from the darkness, and something caught Daniel's eye. A scrap of red fabric, frayed and stiff with dried blood, clutched between Shadow's teeth. The symbol of the gang they thought they had destroyed. The proof that they had never really gone. Daniel's pulse surged, fear and hope colliding. Shadow had survived for a reason, and now Daniel had to understand why. Every heartbeat in the quiet apartment was a drum, counting down to the moment when the past and present would collide, and when the true test of loyalty would begin. The rain came down in unbroken sheets over Riverside Hollow, a modest town pressed between the river's winding banks and the spine of jagged hills beyond. Tonight, it didn't feel like home to anyone, least of all to Daniel Hart, who sat hunched behind the wheel of his patrol car, wipers dragging tired arcs across a windshield, blurred with neon and stormwater. It was nearing midnight. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional blur of headlights and the flickering glow of signs that buzzed weakly against the storm. Daniel felt every hour of his shift in his bones. His late 30s hadn't been kind. The years of service, of funerals and cases that never closed, had left their tally across his face. Stubble shadowed his jaw, and fine lines had begun carving at the corners of his eyes. But it wasn't age that weighed him down. It was memory. 5 years ago, in the chaos of a raid, he had lost Shadow. His canine partner, his closest friend on the force, had vanished in a storm of bullets and smoke when the Black Vulture's cartel ambushed their team at the warehouses. The unit had called it a tragedy of war. They'd held a memorial, buried an empty collar in the ground. But Daniel had never forgiven himself. He had replayed that night endlessly, the bark fading into the dark, the gunfire swallowing every trace. He had stood at the grave alone after everyone else had left, staring at the patch of earth and whispering promises he could never keep. Since then, something in him had gone hollow. Now, as he guided the cruiser through slick avenues, that hollowness pressed on him. The rain drummed a rhythm like a slow heartbeat, and the glow of the dashboard cast his features in washed-out blue. His badge lay heavy against his chest, less a symbol of honor than a weight he couldn't shed. The town outside mirrored him, weary, scarred, trying to keep its lights alive against the storm. Daniel turned down an alley shortcut he'd used 100 times before. Water streamed like rivers along the gutters, carrying trash into clogged drains. The air smelled of asphalt, wet metal, and the faint tang of electricity from the storm. He rubbed at his temple, promising himself he'd grab coffee before heading home. But beneath the hum of rain, something stirred. At first he dismissed it as the echo of runoff dripping from rooftops. Then came the sound again, a faint, brittle cry, almost swallowed by thunder. Daniel slowed the car. His hand hovered near the radio, but instinct kept him from calling it in. Instinct told him to listen. There it was again, thin, human, desperate. He pulled to the curb, engine idling, scanning through the blur of storm. A single figure stood at the far end of the alley beneath a broken street lamp. Small, hunched against the downpour, the figure clutched something tight against its chest. For a moment, Daniel thought it was a trick of the rain, until the figure moved, lifting its head just enough for the lamplight to catch the pale oval of a child's face. His pulse hitched. It was not unusual in towns like Riverside Hollow to find people beaten down by circumstance. But what struck Daniel was not just the boy's presence. It was the stillness with which he stood, soaked to the bone, trembling, yet unyielding. There was a strange kind of courage in the way he lifted one small hand, trying to wave him closer, even as the storm pressed him deeper into the shadows. Daniel felt the years of weariness shift inside him just slightly. He parked the car, rain lashing as he stepped out. His boots splashed through puddles, uniform darkening under the downpour. The boy didn't run. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he hugged a battered teddy bear tighter to his chest. Its seams had split, one eye missing, stuffing poking out like exposed bone. Yet he held it as though it were the last anchor he had left in the world. Daniel slowed his steps, not wanting to startle him. The boy couldn't have been older than 8, though hardship had sharpened his features in ways childhood never should. His hair clung in wet tangles to his forehead, his lips quivered with cold, and his blue eyes, wide, glassy, pleading, met Daniel's with a force that stilled him. Those eyes were not just desperate, they were resolute. "Sir," the boy called, his voice cracking against the storm. "Please, please, you have to help. It's in there." He pointed with a shaking hand towards something deeper in the alley, something Daniel couldn't yet see through the sheets of rain. Daniel stopped a few paces away, studying him. Skepticism tugged at the corners of his mind. Kids sometimes played tricks. Desperation sometimes blurred reality. But there was no trick in this child's trembling frame. No game in the way he clung to that ragged bear, as if clinging to his life. "In where?" Daniel asked, his voice low, careful. The boy's arm jerked toward the shadows again. "The bin. Please. You have to believe me. Nobody else would listen." The rain hammered down between them, but Daniel caught the raw urgency in his words, and something in him, something long dormant, shifted. The night was about to change. The storm pressed heavily over Riverside Hollow, its steady roar filling every crack in the night. Daniel Hart stood in the middle of the alley, rainwater seeping through his collar, watching the boy in the dim halo of the broken street lamp. The child couldn't have been more than 8. His hair was plastered in pale clumps against his forehead, and his small frame shook beneath a hoodie far too big for him. The sleeves hung down past his hands, soaked through and dragging at the cuffs. In his arms, he clutched a teddy bear so worn it seemed more stuffing than fabric. The toy sagged with the weight of the rain, one ear torn, one eye missing, but the boy's grip was fierce, as if letting go would mean losing the last piece of safety he had. Daniel's instincts told him to approach slowly. Children like this didn't survive long on the streets by trusting strangers, even those in uniform. But the boy didn't back away. Instead, he held his ground, his thin sneakers squelching in the puddles, his wide blue eyes locked onto Daniel's, as if begging him to bridge the distance. "Sir," the boy's voice cracked, thin against the downpour. He swallowed hard, clutching the bear tighter. "Please, you have to help. It's in there." His trembling hand shot out, pointing toward a dented green trash bin shoved against the brick wall. Daniel's brows drew together. He glanced at the bin, then back at the boy. "What's in there?" The boy's throat worked as if the words hurt to push out. "A dog." He coughed, then pressed on, desperation breaking through. "He's hurt." Bad. No one else listened. They just laughed at me. His voice wavered. But he's dying. I know he is. Daniel felt the instinctive tug of skepticism. He'd been on the force long enough to know that alleys and dumpsters rarely hid anything good. More often, they were empty or held the aftermath of someone else's cruelty. Sometimes kids cried wolf for scraps of attention. But this boy's expression, raw, terrified, unflinching, burned away the doubt before it could take root. Daniel took a cautious step closer. Rain splattered against his shoulders, trickled down the back of his neck. "What's your name?" he asked, voice steady. The boy hesitated, eyes darting to the bin and back again, as though afraid that wasting time might cost a life. "Noah," he whispered finally. "Noah Blake." Daniel nodded once, filing it away. "All right, Noah. You saw something in that bin?" Noah's breath hitched. He hugged the teddy bear so tightly it seemed strained. "Not just saw. I stayed. I couldn't leave him alone." Daniel studied him, struck by the quiet bravery beneath the fear. The kid was soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, yet he had stood here, guarding a trash bin in the rain, because inside was something, someone, that mattered to him. "Everyone else walked by," Noah added, voice trembling but firm. "They said it was garbage, but I heard him. I stayed." His eyes shone in the lamplight, not just with tears, but with stubbornness, the kind Daniel recognized in people who had been forced to fight for every scrap of dignity. Daniel's chest tightened. He took another step forward, lowering his tone as though speaking to a fellow soldier. "Okay, Noah, I believe you. Show me." The boy blinked up at him, stunned by the words. Then he nodded quickly, his wet hair plastering against his cheek. Without another word, he shuffled toward the bin, sneakers slipping in the puddles, and pressed one small hand against its rusted lid. His whole body shook, but his resolve didn't falter. Daniel followed, each step heavy with a strange anticipation. His hand drifted to the flashlight on his belt, thumb hovering over the switch. Something about the boy's desperation, the way he guarded that bin like a sentinel, churned uneasily in his gut. Noah looked back at him once, eyes wide, pleading. "Please," he whispered. "Just don't let him die." The words pierced Daniel more sharply than the rain's cold bite. He crouched beside the bin, close enough now to smell the sharp tang of rust and rotting rainwater pooling at its base. He glanced at Noah, who stood rigid, bear clutched in his arms, every ounce of his being braced for what came next. Daniel's hand closed on the slick metal lid. The rain drummed louder, as though the storm itself held its breath. He pulled. The lid creaked, hinges groaning in protest. A burst of sour air hit him, damp, metallic, layered with something else beneath it, something alive. In the shadows of the bin, amid discarded bags and broken glass, a shape stirred. Daniel's heart slammed once against his ribs. He leaned closer, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The sight that met him made his breath stall. There, twisted and gaunt, was a German shepherd. Its fur was matted, patchy with bald scars, ribs stark against thin skin. One ear bent unnaturally, the other twitching faintly. Across its hind leg ran a wound, swollen and angry with infection. The dog's chest rose and fell in ragged rhythm, each breath rattling like a broken engine. And then its eyes opened, dull, exhausted, but burning faintly, like embers that refused to die. Eyes that, in a flash, Daniel knew. Recognition struck him so hard he gripped the edge of the bin for balance. His lips parted, breath catching on a name he hadn't spoken aloud in 5 years. Shadow, The dog's gaze flickered, struggling through layers of pain and memory, and for the barest moment, something in those brown eyes shifted. Recognition. Weak, but undeniable. Daniel's throat tightened. Rain pounded the alley. Noah's small voice broke through the roar. "See?" the boy whispered, clutching the bear to his chest, tears mingling with the rain. "I told you. He was waiting." Daniel couldn't answer. His voice was gone, swept away by the weight of what lay before him. The past he thought he'd buried was alive, broken but breathing, at the bottom of a trash bin in a rain-soaked alley. Daniel Hart had seen death in alleys before. Junkies crumpled under flickering lights, bodies discarded in back lots, stray animals curled lifeless against dumpsters. He had told himself he was immune, that years in uniform had built a wall between him and grief. But nothing could have prepared him for this. The beam of his flashlight caught the hollow frame of the German shepherd lying twisted among torn garbage bags and shards of broken glass. The dog's sable coat, once proud and gleaming, was now mottled with bald patches and scars. Each rib jutted starkly, sharp against skin pulled thin by starvation. The storm plastered what remained of his fur to his body, revealing wounds that had healed poorly, stitched with the kind of careless cruelty that spoke not of mercy, but of survival forced upon him. For a long moment, Daniel simply froze, the rain hammering his back, his breath lodged somewhere between disbelief and agony. The dog shifted faintly, a trembling movement of its chest. A low whine, thin and fragile, escaped its muzzle. Daniel's heart clenched. This wasn't just any dog. It couldn't be. But as the animal's head lifted slightly, eyes fluttering open against the rain, Daniel saw them. Brown eyes dulled by exhaustion, yet burning faintly, holding something he recognized deep in his bones. 1,000 patrol nights, 100 raids, the memory of paws thudding beside him in dark alleys. It all came crashing back with brutal clarity. His voice broke in the storm. Shadow. The name came out in a whisper, but the moment it left his lips, the dog's gaze flickered. Recognition, faint but undeniable, glimmered through the pain. Shadow let out another weak whine, nostrils flaring as though catching the scent of a memory long buried. Daniel dropped to his knees, the asphalt soaking through his trousers, the rain blinding his eyes, though he knew the wetness on his face wasn't all from the storm. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering over Shadow's mangled frame. "God, it's you," he murmured. His fingers brushed damp fur, and the dog flinched, a reflex born of years of suffering. But then, as if fighting through instinct, Shadow pressed his nose against Daniel's palm. That single gesture shattered what was left of his composure. 5 years ago, in the chaos of a botched raid, Daniel had thought he lost him forever. They had buried an empty collar, held a ceremony, spoken hollow words about bravery and sacrifice. Daniel had stood at that graveyard, guilt gnawing at him, haunted by the thought that his best friend had died because he wasn't fast enough, strong enough, there enough. Yet here, Shadow was, scarred but breathing, broken but unbroken. Behind him, Noah Blake stood silent, rain dripping from his tangled hair, his teddy bear sagging heavy in his arms. His wide eyes darted between Daniel and the dog as if witnessing a miracle. "I told you," Noah whispered, his voice raw. Nobody listened. "But I knew he was waiting." Daniel swallowed hard, unable to speak, his throat thick with emotion. He gently slid his arm beneath Shadow's body, testing the weight. The dog whimpered but didn't resist, too weak to fight, too trusting to fear. His muscles trembled, as if every movement was a war. "Easy, partner," Daniel murmured, his voice low and steady, the same tone he had used years ago when Shadow braced before a raid. "I've got you now. I'm not leaving you again." Shadow's breath rattled against his chest, warm even through the cold storm. Daniel turned toward Noah, who clutched the teddy bear tighter, his small frame shaking not only from cold, but from something deeper, the fragile hope of being believed. "You stayed with him?" Daniel asked softly. The boy nodded, teeth chattering. "Everybody said it was trash, but I heard him. I couldn't leave him." His lip trembled. "I know what that feels like." The words struck Daniel harder than the rain ever could. He pulled Shadow closer, tucking the dog against him, his jacket already sliding off his shoulders to cover what it could. The weight of Shadow was both heavy and unbearably light. Heavy with history, light with how close he was to being lost forever. The alley around them seemed to fade, the storm dimming to a background hum. It was just them now, a weary cop, a broken dog, and a boy who had refused to walk away. Daniel rose to his feet, muscles straining under Shadow's frail weight. He staggered slightly but steadied himself, his jaw set. "Come on," he said, looking at Noah. "If you were brave enough to stay with him, you're coming with us." Noah's mouth parted in surprise. No one had spoken to him like that in years, not since his mother's death. For a heartbeat, the child's fear cracked, and something else, something fragile and bright, lit his face. He hugged the teddy bear to his chest and nodded. Daniel shifted Shadow carefully in his arms, the dog's shallow breaths warming against his neck. With each step toward the cruiser, the rain seemed to ease, as though the storm itself had yielded to this fragile reunion. Shadow's eyes closed briefly, but not in surrender, in trust. Daniel glanced down at him, voice breaking again as he whispered, "You're home, partner. You're home." And in that rain-soaked alley, where despair had lingered for too many years, hope flickered alive once more. Daniel's heart staggered under the weight in his arms. Shadow's body, though gaunt and frail, felt impossibly heavy, as if carrying not only a battered dog, but also the 5 years of grief Daniel thought he had buried. Rain poured down harder, running in rivulets across Shadow's matted coat, soaking through Daniel's uniform until it clung to his skin. "Easy, partner," Daniel whispered, breath tight as he shifted Shadow closer against his chest. The words came instinctively, the same tone he had used countless times before a raid, before stepping into the unknown. Back then, Shadow would meet his gaze with unflinching confidence. Now, the dog's head lolled weakly against his arm, ears twitching faintly, breath rattling in shallow gasps. Beside him, Noah Blake trotted to keep pace, his thin sneakers slapping against puddles, the ragged teddy bear clutched tightly under one arm. His free hand hovered near Shadow's paw, as if afraid to touch, but desperate not to let go. The alley opened onto the main street, neon signs casting fractured light across rain-slick asphalt. Daniel's patrol cruiser waited at the curb, its headlights glowing like beacons in the storm. He yanked the rear door open with his free hand and lowered Shadow carefully onto the back seat. The dog whimpered softly as his ribs pressed against the leather, but he didn't resist. His eyes flickered open, dull yet fixed briefly on Daniel before sliding shut again. Daniel stripped off his jacket, heavy with rain, and spread it over Shadow's trembling body. He tucked the fabric around him like a blanket, shielding him from the chill. For a moment, Daniel just stood there, his hand lingering on the dog's flank, fighting back the flood of emotion clawing at his chest. A voice broke through the storm. "Don't let him die." Daniel looked up. Noah stood at the open door, rain streaming down his pale face, eyes wide and glistening. His lips trembled, but his voice was steady, with an urgency far too old for an 8-year-old boy. Daniel met his gaze, something unspoken passing between them. He reached out, guiding the boy into the car. "Get in." Noah slid onto the seat beside Shadow, immediately leaning close, his teddy bear squeezed against his chest with one hand, while the other hovered near the dog's paw. Daniel closed the door gently, then moved to the driver's side. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through sheets of rain. Wipers thudded back and forth in a frantic rhythm as Daniel pulled the cruiser onto the deserted street. For a few minutes, silence filled the car, save for the storm outside and Shadow's labored breathing in the back. Daniel gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. His mind spun with questions. How had Shadow survived all these years? Who had kept him alive only to discard him like trash? And why, on this night of all nights, had fate led him back to him through a child's cry in the rain? From the back seat, Noah's soft whisper broke the silence. "You're gonna be okay," he murmured, leaning close to Shadow's muzzle. His voice was hoarse but gentle, carrying a kind of faith Daniel hadn't felt in years. "I stayed with you. I'm not leaving now. You hear me? You're not alone." The boy stroked the edge of Shadow's ear with trembling fingers. Shadow stirred faintly, a weak whine escaping as if answering. Daniel's chest tightened. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the fragile scene unfold. The boy who had been abandoned, comforting the dog who had been tortured. There was something raw and unexplainable in the way they connected, as though pain recognized pain, and in that recognition found solace. "You stayed with him in the rain?" Daniel asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. Noah looked up, startled by the question. "Yeah." He hugged the teddy bear tighter. "Everyone else walked by. They said it was just trash, but I heard him. He was crying. I couldn't leave." His voice cracked at the last word. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes flicking back to the road. He understood that stubborn refusal to abandon someone. It was what had haunted him every day since Shadow disappeared, that he hadn't stayed, hadn't fought harder. And here was this boy, who had done what grown men hadn't. He had waited. "You did good," Daniel said quietly, surprising even himself with the softness of his tone. The boy blinked, wide-eyed. Compliments weren't words he was used to hearing. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, he shifted closer to Shadow, whispering again, as if carrying the weight of Daniel's words into the dog's ears. "You hear that? He said we did good." The cruiser tore through slick streets, headlights reflecting off storefront windows and rain-washed pavement. Each turn brought them closer to the small veterinary clinic on the edge of town, the only place open at this hour, the only hope Shadow had. Daniel's mind flickered with fragments of the past. Shadow racing ahead during a pursuit, barking sharp commands in training drills, pressing his body against Daniel's leg in quiet moments of rest. Each memory was a stab and a balm, pain mingling with gratitude that this wasn't just a ghost. Behind him, Noah leaned his head against the seat, his hand still resting near Shadow's paw. He began humming softly, a shaky tune with no words, just sound, a child's way of keeping fear at bay. Shadow shifted again, as though listening. Daniel caught sight of them in the mirror. The boy's hair plastered against his forehead, the teddy bear squeezed so tightly its seams threatened to split, the dog breathing in shallow, rattling gasps. And somehow, amid all of it, A fragile calm filled the car. For the first time in years, Daniel didn't feel entirely alone. The neon glow of the veterinary clinic's sign flickered faintly through the rain ahead. Relief, sharp and fleeting, washed through him, and he pressed the accelerator, the cruiser surging forward. "Hold on, Shadow," Daniel murmured under his breath. "We're almost there." And in the back seat, as if he understood, Shadow let out a faint whine and pressed his nose weakly into Noah's palm. The neon sign of the Riverside Hollow Veterinary Clinic flickered faintly against the storm, casting pale light across the rain-slick pavement. Daniel Hart pulled the cruiser into the narrow lot, tires hissing through puddles. He cut the engine, and for a moment the only sound was the rain, relentless on the roof, and the shallow, rattling breaths from the back seat. Daniel turned. Shadow lay curled under his jacket, ribs shuddering with each fragile breath. Noah Blake sat beside him, soaked hoodie clinging to his small frame, one hand pressed gently against the German shepherd's paw. His lips moved in whispers Daniel couldn't hear, words meant only for the dog. "Stay with me," Noah murmured, clutching his teddy bear with his other hand. Daniel swallowed hard. He reached back, resting his palm on Shadow's flank. The heat radiating from his body was wrong, feverish, a body losing its battle. His mind screamed to move. He shoved the door open and rounded the car. "Come on," he said, pulling the rear door wide. He slid his arms beneath Shadow, lifting carefully. The dog whimpered, a sound so weak yet piercing, it stabbed through Daniel's chest. "I've got you," Daniel whispered, not letting go. Noah scrambled out. Teddy Bear clutched under his arm and hurried to keep up. Together they pushed through the glass door into the clinic. The air inside was sharp with antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Behind the counter, a woman in her early 50s emerged from the back, drying her hands on a towel. Her grey-streaked hair was pulled into a no-nonsense bun, and wire-frame glasses perched on her nose. Her eyes, though tired, held a steel-edged focus. Dr. Amelia Rhodes had spent decades tending to creatures discarded by the world. She had seen neglect, cruelty, and the quiet suffering left in dark corners. But even she paused at the sight of the broken shepherd in Daniel's arms. "What have you brought me?" she asked, her voice brisk, but not cold. "German shepherd," Daniel rasped. "Found him in a dumpster. He's in bad shape." Amelia stepped forward, her gaze sweeping quickly over the dog. She set the towel aside and motioned sharply. "This way." They moved into the treatment room, a modest space lined with stainless steel tables, cabinets of supplies, and shelves of worn medical texts. The hum of machines mingled with the faint patter of rain against the high windows. Daniel laid Shadow gently onto the table, his jacket sliding off to reveal the full extent of the damage. Noah stood on tiptoe to see, his face pale, eyes wide. Amelia's breath caught, though her hands remained steady. She touched Shadow's side lightly, then began examining with clinical precision. "Severe malnutrition," she muttered, almost to herself. Her fingers traced scars along his flank, old wounds that had been roughly stitched. Multiple lacerations, healed poorly, infection in the hind leg, and here. She pressed lightly at Shadow's neck, frowning. Marks consistent with prolonged restraint. Chains by the look of them. Daniel's jaw clenched. The words landed like blows. Amelia reached Shadow's ear, bent unnaturally. She brushed it gently. "This was broken long ago. He's been living with it ever since." She pulled back, her expression grim. "This isn't neglect. This is sustained abuse. Noah's small hand gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. They hurt him, he whispered. They hurt him for years. His voice trembled, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. Amelia met Daniel's gaze. Whoever did this, they didn't just abandon him, they used him, and when they were done, they threw him away. Daniel's chest tightened until it hurt. He had always imagined Shadow lost quickly, killed in the chaos of the raid, spared long suffering. The reality was worse. 5 years of torment, 5 years stolen from his partner. His throat worked, but no words came. Will he make it? Noah asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. Amelia looked down at Shadow, her hand resting lightly on his side, feeling the weak thud of his heart. I won't lie to you, she said softly. He's critical. He's weak from starvation, and the infection is advanced, but... She leaned closer, her voice tightening. He's still fighting. That counts for something. Shadow stirred faintly, his muzzle twitching as if in response. Amelia called out toward the back. Miguel! A lanky young man, maybe in his early 20s, appeared in the doorway, shaggy hair tucked beneath a baseball cap. He said nothing, only moved quickly as Amelia rattled instructions. IV fluids, antibiotics, clean sutures. Together, they worked with calm efficiency. Amelia cleaned wounds, the antiseptic stinging the air. Miguel shaved patches of matted fur to expose festering gashes. Tubes and lines appeared, connecting Shadow to bags of fluid. Daniel stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, forcing himself to stay still, when every instinct screamed to act. He was a cop, trained to control chaos. But here, he was just a man, watching helplessly as his partner's life hung in the balance. Beside him, Noah climbed onto a stool, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. He leaned close, whispering again, Don't give up, okay? You're not alone anymore. Shadow's eyes flickered open, dull and heavy, but his nose shifted, pressing weakly toward Noah's fingers. The boy gasped softly, a fragile smile breaking through the fear. He heard me, he whispered. Amelia glanced up, her expression softening for just a moment. Animals know when they're not alone, she said quietly. Sometimes it's the difference between surviving and giving up. Daniel looked at Noah, then back at Shadow. The boy's words, the dog's faint response, the relentless fight in both, it struck him with unexpected force. For the first time in years, something cracked through the armor he had built. Amelia straightened, pulling off her gloves. Her tone returned to brisk, but her eyes lingered on Daniel. He's stable for now, but the next 24 hours will decide everything. Keep him warm, keep him calm, and pray he keeps fighting. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Noah leaned closer, pressing his small palm against Shadow's muzzle. I'll stay, he said firmly. I won't let him be alone. And in that moment, in the quiet hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic, a fragile bond took root between a scarred dog, a weary cop, and a boy who had already known too much loss. The treatment room had grown quiet after the flurry of motion. The stainless steel table, once lit harshly by overhead lamps, now glowed softer under the dimmed lights Dr. Amelia Rhodes had left on as she stepped into the back to fetch more supplies. The steady drip of IV fluids punctuated the silence, each drop a fragile reminder that life was still clinging. Shadow lay stretched on the table, his sides rising and falling shallowly beneath the blanket Amelia had draped across him. A sedative had dulled his pain, though his body still twitched occasionally. muscles remembering years of torment, even in restless half-sleep. The smell of antiseptic lingered, sharp and bitter, mingling with the faint musk of wet fur. Daniel Hart stood by the doorway, arms folded tightly across his chest, staring at his partner with a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that Shadow had survived long enough to make it here. Rage at whoever had twisted loyalty and strength into scars and fever. He wanted to storm out, to drive straight into the night and drag answers out of the shadows of Riverside Hollow. But his eyes kept drifting back to the boy. Noah Blake hadn't moved from his spot beside the table. He had climbed onto a stool so he could lean close, his knees tucked under him, teddy bear squeezed tightly in one arm. His wet hoodie clung to his small frame, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. His entire focus was fixed on Shadow. "Don't give up," he whispered again, his voice soft but steady. "You've come too far to stop now." His hand, small and trembling, hovered over Shadow's muzzle before finally settling gently against the damp fur. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Shadow stirred faintly, his nose twitching. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pressed it weakly into Noah's palm. The boy gasped, eyes widening. A small, breathless laugh escaped him, breaking through the fear. "He knows," he whispered. "He knows I'm here." Daniel's throat tightened. He had seen hardened men break under less. Yet here was this child, a boy who had no family left, clinging to faith stronger than any badge, any oath. Noah wasn't just comforting the dog. He was tethering himself to him, stitching together two broken souls with a thread of hope. "You should get some rest," Daniel said quietly, stepping closer. His voice was gentle but carried the authority of habit. "It's late, and you've been out in the storm." Noah shook his head fiercely, his damp hair flinging droplets across his cheek. "No, he needs me. If I leave, he might think I gave up on him too." His voice cracked on the last word. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter. He remembered too clearly the memorial service for Shadow, an empty collar on a table, the folded flag, the speeches. Everyone had left when the ceremony was done, but Daniel had stayed, alone, by that grave. He hadn't wanted Shadow to think he'd been abandoned, even in death. He recognized the same instinct now, burning in Noah's eyes. "People leave all the time," Noah said suddenly, as if reading Daniel's silence. His fingers brushed along Shadow's muzzle, stroking gently. "My mom, my dad, the families they sent me to after, they all left." He swallowed, his chin trembling. "But I'm not leaving him. Not him." Daniel felt the weight of those words settle heavy on his chest. The boy wasn't just making a promise to the dog. He was making one to himself, clinging to the one chance he had to prove loyalty didn't always vanish. Shadow shifted again, a faint whine slipping past his teeth. Noah leaned close, pressing his forehead against the shepherd's. "I've got you now," he whispered, voice breaking. "You're safe. You don't have to fight alone anymore." The ivy line dripped steadily, a rhythm that matched the fragile beat of Shadow's heart beneath the boy's hand. Daniel watched, something stirring deep inside him. For 5 years, he had lived inside walls built from guilt and silence. Now, watching a boy who had nothing give everything he had to a broken dog, he felt those walls crack. Minutes stretched, the storm outside softening to a drizzle against the clinic windows. Noah's whispers faded into the hush of the room. His small body slumped forward, exhaustion finally stealing over him. But even in sleep, His hand remained against Shadow's muzzle, as if fear of losing contact might wake him into another nightmare of abandonment. Daniel moved quietly, pulling a spare blanket from the counter. He draped it over the boy's shoulders, careful not to disturb him. For a moment he stood there, looking at them, the child and the dog, both scarred, both stubbornly alive. It struck him that maybe fate hadn't pulled him into that alley just for Shadow. Maybe it had been for Noah too. Shadow stirred faintly, opening his eyes for a fleeting second. They locked with Daniel's, tired but resolute, as if to say, "I'm still here. Don't let go again." Daniel nodded once, his voice a whisper only Shadow could hear. "We won't. Not this time." The room settled into silence. The fragile bond forged in the rain now anchored in the dim glow of a clinic lamp. And though uncertainty hung heavy, for the first time in years, Daniel Hart allowed himself to believe in something he had long buried. Hope. The storm had thinned by morning, leaving Riverside Hollow draped in a grey stillness. Clouds sagged low over rooftops, muting the light, and the streets glistened with the damp sheen of last night's rain. In Daniel Hart's apartment, the air was heavy with the scent of stale coffee and damp wool. Daniel sat at the small wooden table in his kitchen, his shoulders hunched, a mug of coffee cooling untouched at his elbow. The steam had long since faded, but his eyes weren't on the cup. They were fixed on the heap of files spread across the table, yellowing manila folders, cracked binders, and stacks of reports marked with heavy black ink. At the top, in bold letters stamped across the front of a folder, were the words, "Operation Raven's Break." Daniel's hand lingered on it for a long moment, fingertips brushing the worn edge. He had sworn never to open these files again. For 5 years, they had gathered dust in the precinct archives, and for 5 years he had tried to bury the memories that came with them. But last night those graves opened. Shadow was alive. Broken, scarred, but alive, which meant that everything Daniel thought he knew about that night was a lie. He pulled the folder closer and flipped it open. Paper rustled, sharp against the quiet. Photographs spilled across the table, grainy shots of the dockside warehouses, black and white images of cartel members identified as black vultures. He saw faces he remembered clearly. Their tattoos, their weapons, their smirks, captured in fleeting surveillance shots. He remembered their voices shouting in the dark, the chaos of gunfire, the acrid sting of smoke grenades clouding his vision. He closed his eyes, and the memories rushed in unbidden. The raid had been their largest operation in years. A full team deployed to cripple the Black Vulture's smuggling ring, cut off their supply routes along the river. Daniel could still feel the weight of his Kevlar vest, the cold bite of the night air, the reassuring presence of Shadow pressed against his leg as they waited for the signal to move. Then chaos. A truck horn blaring through the night. A signal. Bullets cracking from every direction. Men shouting in Spanish and English. Colleagues dropping to the ground. And through it all, Shadow had lunged forward, barking furiously, disappearing into the smoke. Daniel's voice had shredded as he called after him, running blind into the fray. But the only response had been the storm of gunfire swallowing the night. When the smoke cleared, Shadow was gone. His hand trembled on the table now, the edges of the photographs blurring. He swallowed hard, fighting the bile rising in his throat. He had told himself that night wasn't his fault. The official report had cleared him. The team had been ambushed. Everyone said Shadow's loss had been inevitable. But deep down, Daniel had never believed it. He had been Shadow's handler, his partner. It had been his job to bring him home, and he hadn't. That guilt had carved itself into him, hollowing out trust. Not just in others, but in himself. He had learned to second-guess, to hold back. Even when his colleagues praised his calmness, his control, he knew it was nothing more than a cage he had built. Now, as he stared at Shadow's name typed neatly in the reports under K9 Unit, presumed deceased, the cage rattled. From the couch in the corner, a small figure stirred. Noah Blake had curled himself beneath a blanket Daniel had found, the ragged teddy bear tucked under his chin. The boy's breathing was steady, but even in sleep his brow furrowed, as though dreams refused to grant him peace. Beside him, on a folded blanket near the heater, Shadow lay curled, his breathing shallow, but stronger than the night before. One bent ear twitched occasionally, his eyes half-lidded, following Daniel's every movement. Daniel glanced at them, then back to the files. His chest tightened. 2 lives tied to him now. A boy who had trusted him in the rain, and a dog who had returned from a grave Daniel had once stood over. He turned the page of the report, forcing himself to read. The details jumped out at him. Shipments lost, evidence gone missing, names scratched out, testimonies redacted. He frowned, his jaw tightening. Too much had been buried after the raid. Too much didn't add up. His gaze lingered on a list of names: informants, officers, handlers. Some had left the force since then. Others still walked the precinct halls. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had trusted these men. He had leaned on them when the guilt threatened to consume him. What if that trust had been misplaced all along? He rubbed a hand over his face, weariness settling deep in his bones. He wanted to slam the files shut, to shove them back into the dark and pretend last night hadn't happened. But then Shadow stirred, letting out a faint growl in his half-sleep, as if reliving some nightmare of his own. Daniel looked at him, and the decision was made. There was no going back. Shadow's survival meant someone had kept him alive all these years. Someone had used him. Someone had discarded him. And that meant the raid, the reports, the names. They weren't just ghosts of the past. They were threads leading to a truth still festering in Riverside Hollow. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the hum of the heater filling the silence. His hand drifted to the badge on his chest, cold against his palm. He had doubted himself for so long, convinced he wasn't strong enough to protect what mattered. But looking at the boy on his couch and the dog by the heater, he realized doubt was no longer an option. Whatever waited in those files, whatever shadows lingered from that night, he would face them. Not for himself, but for them. For the first time in years, Daniel Hart allowed himself to whisper the words he had avoided since the night of the raid. "I'll bring you home. Both of you." The files lay open before him, the ink bleeding with old lies. But somewhere in those pages, he knew, was the truth. And this time he wouldn't stop until he found it. The apartment was hushed, the kind of silence that only comes after a storm has worn itself out. Outside, Riverside Hollow was still cloaked in damp gray, the rain reduced to a faint drizzle against Daniel's window. Inside, the soft hum of the heater filled the air, joined by the occasional rustle of Noah shifting beneath his blanket on the couch. Daniel sat at the table, Operation Raven's break files fanned across the wood like open wounds. His fingers hovered over a small audio recorder, its casing scratched and worn from years in storage. It had been tagged as evidence, but long ago shoved aside when the case was deemed closed. He remembered finding it in the bottom of the file box that morning, almost overlooking it. Now, it sat between his hands, as heavy as a gun. He pressed play. Static filled the room first, a harsh crackle that made Noah stir but not wake. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes narrowing. Then came the sounds he'd been dreading. Distant shouts, boots thundering across concrete, the overlapping bark of orders. The raid unfolded again through tinny speakers, dragging him back 5 years whether he wanted it or not. And then it came. The blare of a truck horn cutting through the chaos. Long, harsh, unmistakable. The sound split the room in two. Shadow, lying near the heater, shot up with a violent jolt. His body stiffened, his bent ear twitching wildly. A guttural growl erupted from his chest, low at first, then rising, vibrating through the floorboards. His teeth bared, hackles bristling, his eyes no longer dulled with exhaustion, but blazing with raw, feral memory. Daniel froze. The growl wasn't just instinct, it was recognition. Shadow lunged to his feet, ignoring the weakness in his scarred leg. His claws scraped against the floor as he staggered toward the sound, nose lifted, pupils dilated. A deep, guttural bark tore from his throat, sharp and furious, a sound Daniel hadn't heard in years. It wasn't the bark of a dog startled by noise. It was the bark of a soldier pulled back onto the battlefield. "No, no, easy, boy," Daniel murmured, rising quickly. His hands reached out, but he didn't dare grab, not while Shadow's body quaked with rage and fear. The horn blared again on the recording, and Shadow snarled, lunging against an invisible enemy. His jaws snapped at the air, his muscles trembling with strain, eyes burning, as if the walls of the apartment had dissolved, and he was once more in the smoke of the docks, surrounded by gunfire and betrayal. "Noah!" Daniel's voice cut through the chaos as he turned toward the couch. The boy was already sitting up, eyes wide, teddy bear clutched tight to his chest. His lips trembled, fear flashing across his small face. But then he moved. Slowly, carefully, he slid off the couch, his bare feet padding across the floor. "Noah, stay back," Daniel warned, but the boy shook his head. "He knows me," Noah whispered, voice small but steady. He approached the trembling shepherd, his hand extended, the teddy bear dangling from the other. "It's okay, Shadow," he said softly, though the dog's growl still rattled the air. "It's not real. You're safe. You're not there anymore." The words were simple, but they carried a weight Daniel couldn't explain. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound of the boy's voice. The growl tapered for a heartbeat, then flared again as the recording continued. More horns, more shouting, but Noah didn't flinch. He stepped closer, lowering himself to his knees so he was level with the dog's furious eyes. "Look at me," Noah whispered. "Not them, me." For a moment, Daniel's heart stopped. Shadow's jaws were inches from the boy's hand, his teeth flashing in the dim light. But then, slowly, painfully, Shadow's gaze shifted. His nostrils flared, and his trembling body seemed to recognize the scent, the presence, the fragile courage of the child before him. The growl broke into a whimper. Noah reached out, his fingers brushing Shadow's muzzle. The shepherd let out a shuddering sigh, pressing into the boy's palm as though grounding himself. His body sagged, muscles giving out, and he collapsed back onto the blanket near the heater. The fury drained from him, leaving only exhaustion, his chest heaving as though he'd just fought the battle all over again. Noah stroked his fur gently, tears brimming in his eyes. "It's okay," he murmured. "They can't hurt you anymore. You're not alone." Daniel stood frozen, the recorder still hissing static in his hand. His throat felt tight, his chest burning. He clicked it off quickly, silence rushing back into the room like a tide. Shadow's body curled against the boy's side, trembling, subsiding. Noah leaned close, pressing his cheek into the shepherd's fur, whispering softly until the dog's breathing slowed. Daniel sank back into his chair, running a hand over his face. The horn hadn't just been a sound. It had been a trigger. Proof that Shadow remembered that night vividly. Proof that he carried the scars not only on his body, but in his mind. It bridged the past to the present in a way Daniel could no longer deny. The black vultures hadn't just taken his partner. They had twisted him, tormented him, left him with wounds that no medicine could erase. And now, Daniel thought bitterly, they had made a mistake. Shadow hadn't forgotten. He carried the truth inside him, burned into his memory with every scar. Across the room, Noah looked up, his small hand still resting on Shadow's muzzle. "He remembers, doesn't he?" the boy asked quietly. Daniel met his gaze and nodded, voice rough. "Yeah, he remembers everything." The boy's lips pressed into a firm line. He hugged his teddy bear tighter, then said, almost defiantly, "Then we can't stop. We have to help him finish it." Daniel's heart clenched. From the mouth of an 8-year-old, it sounded less like a plea and more like a vow. And in that moment, Daniel realized the fight wasn't his alone anymore. The past was clawing its way back into the present, and this time, they would face it together. The room had grown quiet again after the storm of memory. Shadow was resting now, curled into a loose half-circle on the blanket near the heater. His breaths came ragged but steadier than before, each exhale a soft rasp in the silence. Noah hadn't moved far, still kneeling beside him, one hand resting protectively on the shepherd's flank. Daniel sat at the table, the files scattered before him, but his eyes were distant. He could still hear the echo of Shadow's growls when the truck horn blared from the recorder, the fury that had ripped through the dog's battered body. It was proof enough. Shadow remembered. But memory wasn't evidence, not in a world where corruption buried truth beneath paper. He needed something tangible, something undeniable. It was Noah who found it. The boy had been fussing with Shadow's collar, a cracked strip of leather worn thin from years of rough treatment. His small fingers tugged gently, as if trying to adjust it so it wouldn't rub against the dog's neck wounds. That was when he noticed it. A corner of dark fabric, wedged tightly under the collar, its edge frayed and stiff. "What's this?" Noah asked, his voice hushed, more curiosity than alarm. Daniel looked up sharply. Noah pinched the fabric between his fingers and pulled. It resisted at first, as though it had been pressed into place for so long, it had fused with the leather. With a final tug, it came free. A scrap of cloth, no bigger than a child's hand, darkened with dried blood. The boy held it up, eyes wide, the faint light catching the rusty stains. "It was under his collar," Noah whispered, "all this time." Daniel stood, crossing the room in quick strides. He took the scrap carefully, his fingers brushing Noah's for a brief second. The fabric was stiff, brittle, the dried blood flaking at the edges. But beneath the stains, the color showed through. A deep, unmistakable red. Daniel's stomach clenched. His mind shot back to the night of the raid, to the blur of motion and the shadows of men moving through smoke. He remembered the flashes of crimson tied around their arms, their necks, their faces. Red bandanas, the black vulture's signature, the mark of loyalty to their syndicate. He stared at the scrap in his hand, his pulse thundering. This wasn't just coincidence. Shadow had carried it with him, hidden, preserved, for 5 years. "Do you know what this is?" Daniel asked, his voice low. Noah shook his head. His small hands clutched the teddy bear tighter against his chest. It looks like something someone wore. Like a piece of a shirt or... His voice trailed as he studied Daniel's expression. You know, don't you? Daniel exhaled, the weight of recognition pressing hard on him. It's theirs, he said finally. His jaw tightened. The black vultures. They wore these red bandanas. It was their way of marking who belonged. The boy's eyes widened. He looked down at Shadow, who had stirred faintly, his ears twitching at the sound of their voices. So he fought them, Noah said softly. He fought them. And he kept this? Daniel nodded slowly, his throat thick. Looks like it. Maybe he ripped it off in a fight. Maybe it was left on him as a warning. Either way, it's proof. Proof that he was there. That he survived them. Noah's voice trembled. It's proof they hurt him. The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Daniel stared at the fabric, the dried blood catching against the ridges of his fingertips. This wasn't just evidence of who had held Shadow captive. It was a silent testimony of suffering, blood and cloth, carried for years against scarred skin. He reached for an evidence bag from his drawer, sliding the scrap inside carefully, sealing it shut. It felt almost ceremonial, as though he were preserving not just a clue, but a fragment of truth that had survived despite every effort to erase it. Noah watched intently, his small face set in determination. So now we know, he said. His voice was quiet but sure. We know who did it. We can stop them. Daniel looked at him, and for a moment, he was startled by the fire in the boy's eyes. It wasn't the naive hope of a child. It was the fragile, defiant strength of someone who had already lost too much and refused to lose again. He crouched beside Noah, lowering his voice. This helps, but it's only the start. The vultures. They're dangerous. They've buried the truth before, and they won't stop just because we found this. Noah's chin lifted slightly. But Shadow didn't stop either. He kept it. He kept it safe all this time, like he was waiting for someone to find it. He reached out, stroking the shepherd's muzzle gently. He didn't give up, so we can't either. Shadow stirred again, his tired eyes flickering open. They landed on the boy's hand first, then lifted briefly to Daniel. For a fleeting second, there was clarity in them, as if the dog understood that the secret he had carried was finally out. His tail thumped weakly against the blanket, a sound so faint it was almost missed. Daniel swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He remembered the weight of Shadow's absence, the hollow years of guilt. Now here was proof that his partner had never truly been gone, that he had carried the battle with him, even in silence. He placed a hand on Shadow's side, firm and steady. You held on, didn't you? He murmured. All this time. You never let them take it from you. The shepherd let out a faint, weary whine, pressing his nose once more into Noah's palm. Noah looked at Daniel, his voice steady but soft. He was waiting for you. Daniel's eyes burned, but he said nothing. Instead, he stood, tucking the evidence bag carefully among the files. He looked at the boy, then at the dog, and felt something shift deep inside. The past was no longer a closed chapter. It was alive, clawing its way back with scars, scraps, and memories. And this time, he wasn't going to bury it. Get some rest, Noah, Daniel said finally, his voice gentler than he intended. We'll need our strength. This is only the beginning. The boy nodded, curling back beside Shadow, his small body pressed close as if shielding the shepherd from every shadow the world might send their way. Shadow's breathing steadied under his touch, the weight of 5 years of silence eased, if only slightly, by the fragile bond forming in the dim glow of the heater. Daniel returned to the table. The files and evidence spread before him. His reflection glared back faintly from the darkened window, a weary man caught between past and present. But now, in his hands, he held proof. And proof had a way of breaking chains. The drizzle had thinned to a mist that clung to the streets of Riverside Hollow, draping neon signs in a watery haze. Puddles mirrored the glow of flickering street lamps, fractured every time a car hissed by on slick asphalt. The town looked half asleep, but the silence was deceptive. Some shadows moved with purpose, and some eyes watched from places no one thought to look. On the corner near a shuttered pawn shop, a man leaned casually against the frame of a bus stop, cigarette ember glowing like a watchful eye. His name was Ray Delgado, though most who knew him only used his last name, spoken in tones edged with caution. Mid-30s, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with the easy stillness of a predator, Ray had once been the right hand of the Black Vulture's enforcement wing. For years, he had been the muscle behind the syndicate's darkest work. Intimidation, punishment, disappearances. He bore the marks of that life. A jagged scar cutting from his temple down to the corner of his mouth, leaving a permanent sneer, even when he wasn't smiling. Tonight, his leather jacket looked too clean for the damp air. His boots polished, despite the grime of the streets. He didn't dress to blend in. He dressed to remind the world he wasn't afraid of being seen. But tonight, Ray wasn't here to send a message. He was here to confirm a rumor. He flicked ash into the gutter and narrowed his gaze at the far end of the street. Through the shimmer of mist, he saw them. 3 figures walking slowly along the cracked sidewalk. A man, tall, weary, but steady in his stride. A boy, thin and small, clutching a teddy bear under one arm, and limping between them, a dog. Ray's jaw clenched around the cigarette. The shepherd's gait was uneven, his hind leg dragging slightly with every step. His fur was patchy, scars visible even in the poor light. But his posture, head lifted, eyes scanning, was unmistakable. Son of a bitch, Ray muttered under his breath, smoke curling from his lips. It was him. Shadow. The canine ghost they'd all believed buried long ago. Ray had been there the night of the raid, had heard the chaos when the dog disappeared into the smoke. He'd assumed the animal was finished, lost to the river, dead under gunfire. Yet here he was, scarred but standing. He studied the boy for a moment, tilting his head. What was a child doing with them? A stray, maybe, dragged into this mess by accident. Or perhaps not accident at all. Ray had learned long ago that fate had a twisted sense of humor. The man, Daniel Hart. That face he remembered too. A cop who'd been on their tail back then, relentless until the night of the raid broke him. Ray had always respected him, grudgingly. Hart wasn't corrupt like some of the others. Too stubborn for his own good, too loyal to his mutt. When Shadow disappeared, Hart had cracked in the way only men with too much heart cracked. And now the cop was back on the streets, with the very dog the vultures had used and discarded. Ray ground the cigarette out against the pole, his scar pulling into that permanent sneer. This changed everything. He stepped back into the deeper shadow of the alley, his eyes never leaving the trio as they passed under the glow of a neon diner sign. Shadow halted briefly, nose twitching, ears pricking despite the limp. The shepherd growled low, a rumble that carried even across the street. Ray froze, pressing into the wall. Even weakened, The dog's instincts hadn't dulled. His gaze swept the darkness, sharp and suspicious, until Daniel tugged gently at his collar and urged him forward. They moved on, vanishing around the corner. Ray let out a slow breath, but his pulse was steady. He had seen enough. Shadow was alive. The dog, who had survived 5 years of captivity and torture, was now back at his handler's side, carrying scars and, worse, memories. Memories that could unravel everything the black vultures had buried. He pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, the screen glowing against his scarred face. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the contact. For years, he had worked in silence. The vultures scattered, but not destroyed. Some men had gone underground, others into hiding. But this would bring them back to the surface. Finally, he typed a message, short and sharp. "The shepherd lives." He hit send. The screen dimmed, leaving him in shadow once more. For a moment Ray stayed where he was, staring at the wet street where the trio had walked. The boy's pale hair, the cop's weary posture, the dog's scarred frame, all burned into his mind. He exhaled smoke that wasn't there, tasting the bitter memory of blood and rain. "They'll come for you," he muttered to himself, voice low and almost admiring. "And you'll come for them. Guess we'll see who lasts longer." Then he melted back into the night, his figure swallowed by the mist. The town of Riverside Hollow slept on, unaware that its shadows had just begun to stir. The drizzle had finally eased by late evening, though Riverside Hollow still smelled of damp asphalt and gutter water. Streetlights buzzed faintly, halos of mist swirling beneath their glow. The town felt quiet, but Daniel Hart knew better than to mistake quiet for safe. He walked steadily down the cracked sidewalk, Noah Blake at his side, the boy clutching his ragged teddy bear under one arm and a crumpled $5 bill in the other. Between them, Shadow limped faithfully, his gait uneven, the old wound in his hind leg making every step a struggle. Yet his head was lifted, his body taut with instinct. Daniel had insisted on the outing, milk, bread, a few essentials. He wanted Noah to feel a semblance of normalcy, something resembling family life, even if his apartment was still more bunker than home. But more than that, he wanted to keep both the boy and the dog close. He couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that the past wasn't finished with him. The fluorescent sign of a small grocery store flickered ahead, its red letters humming against the gray night. As they approached, Shadow hesitated, his nose lifting. His muscles stiffened beneath the patchy fur, and a low rumble built deep in his chest. Daniel stopped, his hand brushing the shepherd's back. "Easy," he murmured, scanning the street with the habit of a man who'd survived ambushes before. That was when he saw him. Across the street, half-shadowed beneath the skeletal frame of a bus stop, stood a man with a lit cigarette. The glow briefly lit the scar carved across his cheek, pulling his mouth into a permanent sneer. Ray Delgado. Daniel's stomach tightened. The name carried weight in his memory. Enforcer, fixer, ghost of the black vultures. He had seen men flinch at the sound of it back during the raids. And now here Delgado stood, alive, watching. The distance between them was only a street's width, yet the silence stretched long and taut. Delgado didn't move at first. He only exhaled smoke, his eyes locked on Shadow, not on Daniel, not even on the boy, but on the dog, as though confirming what rumor had already whispered. Daniel's jaw clenched. His hand instinctively dropped near the holstered weapon at his side, though he didn't draw. He couldn't. Not here, not with Noah so close. Shadow's growl deepened, his body trembling as his eyes fixed on Delgado. It wasn't the growl of a dog warning off a stranger. It was recognition, the kind that came from memory carved into scars. Shadow knew him. Noah tugged at Daniel's sleeve. "Why is he staring at us?" the boy whispered, his voice tight with unease. "Stay close," Daniel said quietly, his voice calm but edged with steel. Across the street, Delgado smirked faintly, as though savoring the moment. He flicked the cigarette into the gutter, the ember hissing as it hit damp pavement. Then, deliberately, he stepped forward into the light, his gaze never leaving Daniel's. Daniel felt his pulse thrum, steady but sharp. He angled his body slightly, putting himself between Noah and the street. Shadow moved with him, limping forward, lips curled back in a silent snarl. The traffic light at the intersection clicked from green to red, bathing the mist in a crimson glow. For an instant, the world felt suspended. Two men and a scarred dog locked in a silent standoff across slick pavement. Delgado didn't cross. He didn't need to. His message was clear. "I see you. I know." After a long beat, he tilted his head slightly, mocking acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate calm, he turned and melted back into the darkness of an alley. The mist swallowed him whole. Noah exhaled sharply, clutching his teddy bear tighter. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice trembling. Daniel kept his eyes on the alley a moment longer before answering. "A ghost from the past," he said quietly. "One we'll have to deal with." Shadow barked once, sharp and low, the sound cutting through the quiet like a warning shot. Daniel laid a hand on the dog's head, steadying both of them. Then he looked down at Noah, whose blue eyes still darted toward the shadows. "We'll be okay," Daniel said firmly, though the weight in his chest betrayed him. "As long as we stay together." They entered the grocery store, the bell above the door chiming softly. Inside, the bright hum of fluorescent lights felt almost unnatural after the misty silence outside. Noah wandered toward the shelves, his boyish excitement momentarily breaking through his fear as he reached for crackers and a bottle of orange soda. But Daniel couldn't shake the image of Delgado's scarred face, the smirk, the way his eyes had fixed on Shadow, like a predator recognizing prey. He knew what it meant. The black vultures weren't finished, and now they knew Shadow was alive. The quiet war that had begun 5 years ago was stirring again. The fluorescent hum of the grocery store still lingered in Daniel's ears as he stepped back out into the night with Noah and Shadow. The boy clutched a small paper bag filled with crackers and soda, his teddy bear tucked under his other arm. Shadow padded beside him, limping heavily but keeping pace, every nerve alive, ears flicking at the faintest sound. The streets were quiet again, the mist curling low along the pavement, wrapping the town in a veil of half-light. To anyone else, it might have seemed peaceful. To Daniel, it was suffocating. Quiet streets were cover for predators. And tonight, he knew predators were watching. They had walked 2 blocks when the stillness shattered. A black van roared around the corner, tires screeching against wet asphalt. Its headlights sliced through the fog, blinding for an instant. The van braked hard, skidding across the puddles until it blocked the sidewalk. "Noah!" Daniel barked, pulling the boy back instinctively. The van doors flew open. 2 men leapt out, one tall and wiry, the other stockier with a shaved head and fists like hammers. Their boots splashed through water as they lunged toward the boy, their eyes cold and practiced. Noah froze, blue eyes wide, the teddy bear nearly slipping from his grip. Fear rooted him in place, his body trembling. But Shadow moved before anyone else could. The shepherd surged forward with a guttural snarl, his scarred body a blur of determination. Pain shot through his injured leg, but he ignored it, hurling himself at the stocky man. His teeth sank deep into the man's sleeve, tearing fabric and flesh alike. The man roared, stumbling backward, swinging his arm to shake the dog off. But Shadow held firm, jaws locked, his growl vibrating like thunder in his chest. The wiry man reached for Noah, grabbing his thin arm roughly. The boy cried out, twisting, but the grip only tightened. "Let him go!" Daniel's voice cracked like a gunshot. His pistol was in his hand before the thought finished forming. He leveled it squarely at the man's chest, his stance steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Police! Drop him now!" The man hesitated, eyes darting from Daniel's weapon to the snarling shepherd tearing into his partner's arm. Shadow twisted, dragging the stocky man to his knees. Blood streaked down the man's sleeve, his curses filling the street. Still, the dog didn't release, his jaws clamped with 5 years of rage. Every scar a reminder of the torment he had survived. On the second-floor balcony of a brick apartment building, a window screeched open. Mrs. Green, thin, sharp-eyed, with auburn-dyed hair tied back in a messy knot, leaned out. Her eyes widened at the chaos below. "I'm calling the cops," she shouted, her voice slicing through the night. "I see you. I've got you all on camera." Her words struck like a siren. The wiry man released Noah's arm with a shove, cursing under his breath. The stocky man ripped free of Shadow's bite, stumbling back with his sleeve torn to shreds and his forearm dripping blood. Both men retreated in a scramble, diving back into the van. And the engine roared, tires spitting water as the van screeched away into the mist, leaving behind the echo of violence and the smell of burnt rubber. The street fell silent again, except for the boy's sobs. Noah dropped to his knees, arms wrapping desperately around Shadow's neck. Tears streaked his face as he pressed himself into the shepherd's bloodied fur. "He saved me," Noah whispered through gasps. "He saved me." Shadow panted heavily, his sides heaving from the strain. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his stance remained unyielding. Even as his blood mixed with the attackers, his tail gave a faint wag, brushing against the boy's arm. Daniel holstered his weapon with shaking hands. He crouched beside them, his palm resting firmly on Noah's back. His eyes burned as he looked at the battered dog shielding the child. Shadow, broken and scarred, had stood against men half his size. He had chosen to put himself between Noah and danger, no matter the cost. "Mrs. Green was still shouting from her window, her phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, send someone fast. There was an attack. 2 men, black van. Yes, a police officer is here." Her eyes met Daniel's briefly, and she gave a nod, her face pale but resolute. Daniel nodded back. She had seen enough to know the truth. The shadows were moving again, and now the whole block knew it. He turned back to the boy and the dog. Noah clung to Shadow, his small frame shaking with every sob. Shadow licked the boy's tear-streaked cheek once, a slow, deliberate gesture, as if to reassure him. Daniel's voice softened, though his chest still thundered with fury. "It's all right, kid. You're safe. He won't let anything happen to you. Neither will I." The boy looked up at him, eyes red but glimmering with something fragile. Trust. For Daniel, the moment was like a blade to the heart. He had failed once, 5 years ago, when Shadow disappeared into smoke and silence. He had sworn never to let that happen again. And now, with Noah trembling against him and Shadow standing guard, Daniel knew he was bound by more than duty. This was family now. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder, slicing through the mist. But Daniel hardly heard them. His focus was on the boy's fragile grip and the dog's steady presence. The black vultures had made their move, and they had underestimated the resilience of the broken. The fight was only beginning. The sirens had long since faded when Daniel turned the key to his apartment door. His hand lingered on the knob, reluctant, before he pushed it open. The place wasn't much, just a second-floor walk-up on Riverside Hollow's east side. But tonight, it felt like a fortress. He ushered Noah in first. The boy's sneakers squeaked against the hardwood, water dripping from the frayed cuffs of his jeans. His teddy bear, seams stretched thin, was clutched tight. Wide eyes darted over the couch, the small table, the unopened mail on the counter. Not a dream home, but to Noah it must have felt like safety. Shadow limped in last. Daniel guided the shepherd to a folded blanket near the heater, where the dog sank down with a groan. Even exhausted, his eyes followed Noah, unwilling to rest until the boy was safe. Daniel locked the door, sliding the deadbolt. For the first time that night, his shoulders eased, never relaxed, but eased enough to breathe. The room was quiet, save for the heater's hum. Noah hovered by the couch, glancing between Daniel and Shadow as though afraid either might vanish. "You can take the couch," Daniel said gently. "It's not much, but it's warm." The boy hesitated. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse from the screams. Daniel nodded. "Yeah, you've earned it." Noah curled onto the cushions under a blanket. His teddy bear nestled against his chest, but his gaze lingered on Shadow. When he whispered, "Good night, boy," the shepherd's tail thumped once, a tired gesture that carried loyalty's weight. Fear softened from Noah's face. Within minutes, he was asleep. Daniel stood frozen, staring. A boy who had no one. A dog who had endured 5 years of hell. And between them, an invisible thread binding it all together. He sat at the table, the ledger of betrayal and faces from the raid gnawing at him. Yet tonight, none of it mattered more than the 2 lives under his roof. On the couch, Noah had rolled in his sleep, one hand dangling toward the floor. His face, usually pinched with tension, looked soft now. Daniel thought of his own childhood, his father gone, nights of silence echoing in an empty house. He had sworn no one else should ever feel that kind of abandonment. And now this boy had stumbled into his life, reminding him of promises he hadn't realized he still carried. A faint sound drew him back. Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes steady on Daniel. It wasn't just a look, it was a question. Daniel exhaled. "Yeah," he murmured. "They're ours to protect now." Shadow huffed softly, settling again. Outside, mist thickened over Riverside Hollow. But inside that modest apartment, 3 broken souls lay beneath the same roof. The scars hadn't vanished, and danger still loomed, but something stronger stirred. Not duty, not vengeance, family. Morning seeped timidly through the thin curtains. The storm had passed, the streets washed clean but not renewed. Inside, stillness lingered. Daniel stood in the kitchen, staring at a skillet as if it were foreign. A spatula trembled in his grip. The smell of batter and butter filled the room, uneven, clumsy, but earnest. On the couch, Noah stirred. His hair was tousled, his teddy bear still tucked under his arm. For a moment, confusion clouded his face. Then he saw Shadow curled by the heater, ears pricking as the boy moved. Relief flickered in Noah's eyes. "You're awake," Daniel said, flipping the pancake awkwardly, half folded in on itself. He muttered a curse. "Figured you might be hungry." Noah sat up, cautious. "You made breakfast?" Daniel scratched the back of his neck, a dry laugh escaping. "That's one word for it." The boy padded into the kitchen, teddy bear swinging at his side. He sniffed the air, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "It smells good." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Praise wasn't something he knew what to do with. He cleared his throat. "Don't say that until you've tasted it." He set a plate on the table, pancakes uneven but steaming. A dusty bottle of syrup appeared from the back of the cupboard. Noah climbed into the chair carefully, as though afraid the invitation might vanish. Shadow limped closer, settling by his side, eyes sharp on the child. Noah cut a piece, tasted, and smiled. Real, unguarded. "It's good." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat across, watching the boy eat, watching his hand drift to Shadow's head between bites. For a moment, the apartment felt almost normal. A man, a boy, a dog. Breakfast in the pale light of morning. But the illusion cracked quickly. Daniel's eyes shifted to the window. The street outside looked calm. Strollers, delivery trucks, sunlight breaking mist. But he knew better. Delgado's scarred face, the van, the clawing hands, the black vultures would come again. This peace was borrowed time. "Do you always eat breakfast like this?" Noah asked suddenly, syrup on his chin. "Not really. Usually just coffee, maybe a bagel." The boy studied him with unsettling clarity. "So, you did this for me?" Daniel froze, fork halfway to his mouth. He glanced at Shadow, who seemed to be watching too, expecting truth. Daniel lowered the fork. "Yeah, I guess I did." Noah ducked his head, hiding his grin behind the teddy bear. Shadow's tail thumped against the floor, soft but steady. Something stirred in Daniel's chest, not duty, not guilt, something closer to belonging. The silence in his apartment wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Later, the smell of syrup lingered as Daniel stood by the window with coffee in hand. Riverside Hollow looked quiet, but his instincts churned. The storm outside wasn't over. Behind him, Noah padded across the floor in socks, teddy bear under one arm. He drifted toward Shadow, who lay curled near the heater. The shepherd opened his eyes as Noah knelt, resting a small hand against his muzzle. "You're safe," the boy whispered, sure and steady. Daniel turned, watching. He had told himself Noah was temporary, a case to be handed to the system. But seeing him now, clinging to Shadow, clinging to this fragile sense of belonging, Daniel knew something had shifted. The boy wasn't temporary. Noah caught his gaze. His eyes held a silent question. "Will you send me away too?" Daniel set his mug down, crouching beside them. He rested a hand on Noah's thin shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. Not as long as I'm here." The boy's lips parted, eyes shimmering. Shadow pressed his nose against Noah's knee, sealing the vow. Daniel swallowed hard. "I couldn't save everyone back then. But I can save you now. Both of you." Noah leaned into him, trembling. Not with fear, but with relief. He buried his face against Daniel's arm, clinging to the anchor he'd been searching for. Daniel held him steady, his hand on the boy's back. For the first time in years, he felt whole. Sunlight cut across the room, warming a boy, a scarred shepherd, and a man who had forgotten what belonging felt like. The danger outside still waited, coiling in Riverside Hollow's shadows. But now Daniel knew what he was fighting for. Not justice, not vengeance. Home. And nothing. No syndicate, no ghost from the past, no betrayal, would take it away. By night, the docks were a graveyard. Cargo trucks and shouting dockhands gave way to silence, mist, and the river's oil-stained breath. Containers loomed like tombstones, their paint peeling under the salt air. Daniel Hart's boots echoed as he walked, flashlight cutting through the dark. Noah clung to his side. Teddy bear gripped tight. Shadow limped ahead, nose to the damp boards, every muscle taut. Even wounded, the shepherd's instincts blazed. Daniel hadn't planned to bring Noah, but the boy had insisted, and Shadow seemed to need him. Tonight, the dog moved with strange certainty, as if memory itself pulled him forward. They reached a row of warehouses. Shadow halted before one, growl low, pawing at the rusted door. Daniel crouched, studying the lock, busted before. He drew his weapon, eased the door open. Inside, dust drifted in his beam, swirling over broken pallets and damp air laced with something acrid, chemical. Shadow pushed ahead, weaving through debris until he stopped at an uneven patch of floor. His eyes cut back, sharp despite the scars. Daniel pried the boards loose. Beneath lay a steel box, rusted but intact. He smashed the lock open. Inside, ledgers, papers, oilcloth-wrapped notebooks. Columns of names, dates, coded shipments. Payoffs to officers. Bribes to officials. Proof. Daniel's hand trembled as he read familiar names. Officers he'd worked beside. Men he'd trusted. He slammed the book shut, bile rising. Noah's small voice broke the silence. "What is it?" "Proof," Daniel said tightly. "Of everything. And who's helping them? The bad guys?" Daniel met his gaze. "Not just the bad guys. Some of the ones with badges." The boy frowned, not yet able to grasp betrayal's weight. Shadow pressed close to Daniel, body rigid, eyes flicking toward the door. The shepherd remembered too. Daniel shoved the papers back into the box. Carrying them made him a target, but leaving them wasn't an option. He hoisted the weight, Noah whispering, "Shadow. He remembered this place, didn't he?" Daniel looked at the dog. Shadow's tail brushed the floor once, weary but certain. "Yeah," Daniel murmured. He remembered. The truth was ink on paper, damning and irrefutable. And now, there was no turning back. The bell above the clinic door jingled weakly as Daniel staggered in, steel box in his arms. Amelia Rhodes looked up from her paperwork, eyes narrowing at the sight of his face. "You look like a man carrying a ghost," she said. "Close enough." He dropped the box with a thud. Noah followed, guiding Shadow carefully on the leash. The shepherd limped, but stayed alert, ears twitching, as if still back in the warehouse. Amelia's gaze softened at the sight of them, then fixed on the box. "What's in it?" Daniel flipped the latch. Ledgers and papers stared back, like the eyes of the dead. He opened one, columns of names and numbers spilling under the light. Proof, payoffs, shipments, cops on the take, all of it. Amelia scanned the page, face pale. "Dear God." "I thought the raid ended it," Daniel rasped. "Men died for this. Shadow almost died for this, and the rot was deeper the whole time. Silence stretched. Outside, a crow called, harsh against the stillness. Amelia closed the ledger gently. "And you brought it here?" "I trust you," Daniel said. "There aren't many left I can say that about." Her eyes lingered on Shadow, stretched out on the floor with his muzzle on his paws. Noah sat beside him, stroking the scarred fur. The shepherd's tail tapped faintly with each whisper from the boy. "You see it, don't you?" Amelia asked. Daniel frowned. "See what?" She nodded toward them. "That bond. That dog. Trust that boy more than anything else. After everything, he still chooses him." "Shadow survived for a reason, Daniel. Maybe this is it." Daniel swallowed hard. Guilt had chained him for 5 years, but watching Shadow lean into Noah's touch, he felt something shift. Amelia's voice gentled. "You don't get to decide if they belong to you. They already do. The only question is whether you're brave enough to belong to them." Daniel turned away, pacing, hand raking through his hair. "He's just a kid. He shouldn't have to carry this." "And yet he is," she said softly. "And he's stronger than you think." Daniel looked back. Noah hummed quietly, fingers tangled in Shadow's fur, both survivors anchoring each other. Amelia's hand touched his arm. "Maybe you've already found the family you thought you lost." The words hit like a bell in his chest. Later, the apartment was quiet, but for the hum of the heater and Shadow's breathing. Noah slept on the couch, teddy bear pressed close. The shepherd curled protectively toward him, even in sleep. Daniel sat at the table, ledgers spread like bones, each name cut deeper. Businessmen, dock workers, cops. His eyes froze on one, Sergeant Paul Miller. The letters blurred. Miller, his mentor, his friend. The man who trained him out of the academy, who steadied his temper, who told him Shadow's disappearance wasn't his fault. And here was his name, inked into corruption. Daniel flipped pages frantically. Miller's name again and again, linked to shipments, payments, raids misfired by design. The chair scraped loud as he pushed back. Breath, ragged. Betrayal wasn't theory anymore. It wore Miller's face. Shadow lifted his head, growl rumbling low. Recognition burned in the shepherd's eyes. Daniel whispered hoarsely, "Miller." It was Miller all along. The dog's growl deepened, body rigid. He remembered. Memories shattered. Miller's easy smile, reassuring hand, whispered loyalty. All lies. Rage boiled where guilt had lived. For years, Daniel had cursed himself for losing Shadow, but the truth was worse. Someone had stolen him, broken him, discarded him. That someone was the man Daniel once called brother. A soft voice broke the storm. "Daniel." Noah stood barefoot, blanket slipping from his shoulders. He looked at the papers, then back at Daniel. "What's wrong?" Daniel struggled for air. "Something I didn't want to see." The boy peered closer. "Is that the man who hurt Shadow?" Daniel hesitated, then gave the truth. "Yes, the man who should have protected us. He sold us out." Noah's jaw tightened. He looked down at Shadow, who rose to stand beside Daniel, hackles bristling. The boy laid a hand on the dog's scarred back. "Then we don't let him win." Daniel's throat clenched. The boy wasn't fragile now. He was steel. He brushed his hand across Shadow's neck, then set the other on Noah's shoulder. "No, we don't." The ledger lay open, ink bleeding betrayal. But under the thin light, with a boy clutching his teddy bear and a scarred dog growling low, Daniel felt resolve take root. Miller's name filled the pages, but it would not be the last word. Shadow's growl eased into a steady rumble, gaze locked on Daniel as if to say, "We fight. We finish this." Daniel drew a long breath and closed the book. His hands no longer trembled. He would confront Miller. He would rip the black vultures out by their roots. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for family. The precinct was nearly empty at that hour. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, pale glow spilling across rows of vacant desks. The hum of the vending machine and the occasional groan of the old building filled the silence like unwelcome guests. Daniel sat at his desk, papers spread before him, though unread. The ledger lay tucked in his bag at his feet, its weight like a stone dragging at his chest. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm. Shadow lay beneath the desk, scarred body curled tight, ears twitching at every faint sound from the hallway. When Daniel's boot brushed him, the shepherd's tail thumped once. Steady reassurance. The bullpen door creaked. Sergeant Paul Miller stepped inside, uniform crisp, sandy hair combed neat, badge gleaming. To anyone else, he was the picture of calm authority. To Daniel, he was something else entirely. Miller's smile came easy. "Burning the midnight oil, Cole?" His voice was friendly, but beneath it ran an edge, sharp as glass. Daniel leaned back in his chair, forcing calm. "Some files don't rest just because the clock says so." Miller chuckled, boots echoing on the linoleum as he strolled closer. "You always did have that stubborn streak. Can't leave well enough alone." Daniel let silence stretch before answering. "Sometimes well enough isn't good enough." The smile faltered. Miller leaned against the desk, casual, almost brotherly, but his eyes flicked to the bag at Daniel's feet. Shadow lifted his head, muscles taut, a low growl vibrated from his chest. Miller glanced at him, mask cracking. "Strange seeing him alive," he said evenly. "Thought we buried that mutt 5 years ago." Daniel's pulse quickened. He kept his voice flat. "Some things don't stay buried, not when the ground's rotten." The light dimmed in Miller's eyes, smile gone brittle. "Careful, Daniel. Dig too deep. You might not like what you find." Daniel leaned forward, gaze unflinching. "That your way of telling me to stop asking questions?" Miller's voice dropped, words laced with warning. "Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." The phrase hung between them like a knife. Shadow snarled, louder now, teeth bared. Miller's hand twitched near his holster. Time slowed. Then he moved. The pistol cleared leather, but before the barrel lifted, Shadow lunged. His scarred body struck Miller hard, jaws clamping down on his arm. The gun fired, the crack splitting the silence. A lamp shattered, glass raining across the floor. Papers exploded into the air like frightened birds. Miller cursed, staggering, trying to shake the dog loose. Shadow's teeth held, growl feral, unstoppable. Daniel's chair toppled as he drew his weapon, voice cutting through the chaos. "Drop it, Paul!" Blood streamed down Miller's arm, uniform torn, fury twisting his face. "You think you can fight them, Cole? The vultures own this city. They own you!" Shadow shook violently, forcing the pistol loose. It skidded under a desk. Daniel advanced, weapon steady. "They don't own him," he said, nodding to the shepherd. "And they sure as hell don't own me." Miller shoved Shadow off, staggering back, clutching his bleeding arm. The shepherd stumbled but planted himself again, hackles raised, ready to strike. Miller's breath came ragged, eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over." Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger. For a heartbeat, he considered ending it. But Shadow stood firm, not lunging now, guarding, waiting. Not vengeance. Justice. Daniel exhaled, lowering his weapon slightly. Miller backed toward the door, blood dripping steady. "You just signed your death warrant," he hissed. His voice cracked like a vow. Then he was gone, door slamming shut, echoing through the precinct like the toll of a bell. Silence returned, jagged and raw. Papers drifted to the floor, glass glittered under the buzzing lights, and the air stank of gunpowder and blood. Daniel stood in the wreckage, chest heaving, pistol still raised. Shadow limped back to him, muzzle streaked red, chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Daniel dropped to his knees. The shepherd pressed against him at once, scarred body solid against his chest, as if carrying the weight for both of them. "You saved me again," Daniel whispered, voice breaking. His hand buried in Shadow's fur, his forehead pressed to the dog's head. For a long moment, man and dog stayed locked together, warriors scarred but unyielding. Memories crashed in. Shadow as a pup, too big for his paws, but sharp-eyed. Nights on patrol, trusting each other's instincts more than their own. The raid 5 years ago, the chaos, the gunfire, and then silence. Daniel had thought silence meant death. But Shadow had endured, scarred yet loyal. Even in chains, he hadn't broken. And now he was here again, fighting for him as if no time had passed. "You never gave up on me," Daniel murmured, stroking along the shepherd's back. Shadow's tail thumped weakly, and Daniel's throat tightened. He pulled back enough to meet those brown eyes. In them, he saw not just survival, but forgiveness. Proof their bond had never snapped. Tested, burned, but never broken. "I swear," Daniel said, voice steadier now, conviction rising. "I won't let them take anything else. Not from you. Not from the boy. Not from this city." At the mention of Noah, Shadow's ears flicked. He glanced toward the desk where the ledger lay hidden, then back at Daniel, as if to say, "The fight isn't done." Daniel tightened his hold, his voice a vow. "We finished this. Together." The fluorescent lights hummed above, the only witness to the oath spoken in the ruins of the precinct. Shadow eased down, exhaustion overtaking him, but his body pressed close to Daniel's, steady as ever. Daniel stayed kneeling, hand in the dog's fur, heart pounding with clarity. The mask had fallen. The enemy had a name. Paul Miller. The war was no longer in the shadows. It was here, in the open. And this time, Daniel wasn't fighting alone. The precinct buzzed with the usual morning rhythm. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, footsteps echoing down the halls. But to Daniel, it all felt different now. The walls seemed complicit, steeped in the rot revealed by the ledger. Every nod, every passing glance carried suspicion. Who could he trust? Who already knew? Shadow padded beside him, head low but eyes sharp, scanning faces with silent judgment. Noah was safe at Amelia's clinic for the day, but Daniel knew that wouldn't last. The boy would fight to be part of this, because that's who he was. For now, Daniel needed allies, clean ones. He had 2 names. Officer Mark Jensen was still green enough to carry idealism like a badge. Daniel found him in the locker room, lacing up his boots. "Didn't think I'd see you this early, Sarge," Jensen said with a grin. "Usually you're the last one out, not the first one in." "Things change," Daniel replied, leaning on the lockers. His tone wiped the smile from the younger man's face. "What's going on?" Daniel studied him. "How far would you go to stand against the kind of rot that eats a city from the inside out?" Jensen blinked, then lowered his voice. "You mean corruption?" Daniel nodded. Jensen's jaw tightened. "My dad worked the docks, lost jobs because the wrong people pulled strings. I didn't join the force to watch that happen again." Daniel saw the truth in his eyes, the hunger to prove himself. Good. Because I might need you in ways you're not ready for. Jensen swallowed, but his chin lifted. Then, I'll get ready. Detective Claire Harlow was different, scarred, relentless, a woman who had lived in the dirt of Riverside Hollow long enough to know its stench. Daniel found her in the records room, sifting through files. "Cole," she said evenly, "you look like hell." "Feels mutual," he answered. Her eyebrow arched. "What do you need?" Daniel's voice dropped. "I've found something, tied to the raid 5 years ago. The vultures aren't gone, not even close." Claire stilled, her scar pulling taut. "I always knew that mess wasn't clean. Too many gaps, too many bodies without answers." "I've got proof," Daniel said. "Names, payoffs. Officers in our own house." She studied him for a long moment. "You're sure?" "As sure as I've ever been." Finally, she shut the file she'd been holding. "Then you'll need people you can trust. That's why I'm here." Her gaze flicked to Shadow by the door, scarred and watchful. Something softened in her expression. "You still trust the dog?" Daniel's throat tightened. "With my life." She nodded once. "Then I'll stand with you. But once this starts, there's no going back." Daniel didn't hesitate. "I was ready the moment I saw that ledger." They met in the briefing room. Daniel, Claire, Jensen. The air was thick with unspoken fear. Daniel laid out fragments of the truth, the resurgence of the vultures, the proof of corruption, the danger of exposure. Jensen's bravado faltered, replaced by grim resolve. Claire listened silently, tapping her scarred cheek, weighing every risk. Finally, she said, "If Miller's in this, it's not just a gang problem. It's about cleaning our own house." "Exactly," Daniel said. "We can't trust anyone else. If word leaks, we're finished." Shadow lay at his feet, eyes flicking between them. When Jensen shifted nervously, the shepherd's tail brushed Daniel's boot. Subtle, but reassuring. Daniel looked at them both. "This ends at the docks. That's where we cut them down. But no chatter, no leaks. Just us. And Shadow." Claire gave a curt nod. Jensen straightened, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I'm in." For the first time in days, Daniel felt the weight lift slightly. It wasn't just him and a scarred dog anymore. He had allies. Flawed, vulnerable, but willing. Late afternoon lights slanted across Amelia's clinic. Noah sat cross-legged on the floor, Shadow's head in his lap, the boy's fingers tracing scarred ears as he whispered words only the dog seemed to hear. Daniel lingered in the doorway, rehearsing words he hated. Finally, he stepped inside. "Noah." The boy looked up, cautious. "Yeah?" Daniel crouched to eye level. "I need you to stay here with Amelia for a while." Noah's hand tightened on Shadow's fur. "Why?" "Because it's about to get dangerous. The men who hurt Shadow, they'll do anything to stop us." "I can help," Noah said fiercely. "The best way you can help is by staying safe." Daniel's voice softened. "This fight isn't for kids." "But Shadow needs me." The shepherd lifted his head, ears flicking at his name. Daniel tried again. "He's scarred, tired. He doesn't need you in danger too." "You're wrong," Noah shot back. "He listens to me. You saw it. He trusts me." The words struck deep. Daniel remembered Shadow pressing his muzzle into the boy's palm, tail thumping faintly at his whisper. The bond was undeniable. "Noah," Daniel said quietly, "I promised myself I'd protect you. I can't take you into this." Tears welled, but Noah's voice stayed steady. "If you leave me, I'll follow. Because Shadow needs me, and I need him. We're family now." The word cracked something inside Daniel. Family. A word he hadn't let himself believe in for years. He looked at Shadow. The shepherd's eyes met his, steady and certain, as if agreeing. Daniel sighed, defeated. "You don't make this easy, kid." "Neither does life," Noah whispered. Silence hung between them until Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, you stay close. You do what I say, when I say it. No running off. You're part of the team now." Noah's tears spilled, but his smile shone through. "I promise." Daniel pulled him briefly into an embrace, awkward but real. When he let go, Shadow rose and brushed against them both, sealing the pact in silence. Night fell over Riverside Hollow, the riverfront lit by sodium lamps and the glow of shipyards. In Daniel's apartment, the kitchen table had become a war room. Maps of the docks lay spread flat, corners pinned with mugs. Notes marked container yards, patrol routes, warehouses. Claire stood across the table, arms folded, eyes scanning the plan. "They'll have high ground, catwalks, cranes, rooftops. If they're expecting us, it'll be a kill box." "That's why we go quiet, fast, close," Daniel said. "Surprise is all we've got." Jensen shifted uneasily, shotgun slung over his shoulder. "And if they've got numbers, they will," Claire said flatly. Daniel's gaze swept them both. "Then we trust each other, and we trust him." He nodded to Shadow. The shepherd lay nearby, stiff but alert, eyes locked on the maps. Noah sat beside him, teddy bear forgotten, small hands steady on the dog's back. "He can still lead us," the boy whispered. "Even if he limps, he remembers." Daniel's chest tightened. "Claire, you and Jensen cover the eastern yard, sightlines on the container rows. I'll take point with Shadow. Noah stays with me." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You're taking him?" Daniel didn't flinch. "Shadow won't move without him. And if it comes down to it, Noah's voice may be what pulls him through." Claire considered, then gave a sharp nod. "Then, we don't leave anyone behind." Weapons were checked with quiet precision. Jensen racked his shotgun. Claire loaded magazines with practiced calm. Daniel laid out his Glock, slid a knife into his boot. He crouched beside Noah, pressing a flashlight into his hands. "Stay close. If it goes dark, point this at Shadow. He'll follow you." Noah nodded solemnly, clutching it like a sword. Shadow rose slowly, limp pronounced, but posture strong. He pressed his shoulder to Daniel's leg. Daniel stroked his scarred head. "One more fight, partner. Just one more." The dog's tail thumped once. The maps were folded, pockets filled with steel and resolve. As they stepped into the night, the cool air reeked of oil and river mist. Cranes loomed in the distance, ships hunched like sleeping giants. Daniel looked at his allies, at the boy and the dog who had already survived more than most men. He drew a breath that felt like steel. This ends tonight. The docks stretched before them like a steel labyrinth. Shipping containers towered in stacks, their rusted sides streaked with salt and graffiti. Sodium floodlights buzzed overhead, casting jagged shadows that twisted between the rows like predators. Beyond, the river whispered against the pilings, carrying the scent of oil and decay. Daniel crouched behind a rusted forklift, Glock steady in his grip. Shadow moved ahead, nose to the ground, body taut despite the limp. Every scar on the shepherd seemed to remember this place. Claire Harlow glided at Daniel's flank, pistol raised, scarred face hard with focus. Officer Jensen trailed close, his shotgun trembling in his hands, breath too loud. "Slow it down," Daniel whispered. "If you can hear it, so can they." Jensen exhaled through his nose, nodding quickly. They pressed deeper. Containers formed narrow choke points, each shadow threatening ambush. Daniel's eyes tracked every angle. Shadow froze at a corner, ears pricked, growl low. A faint scrape echoed above, boots on steel, rifles shifting. "Eyes up," Claire murmured. Figures moved along a catwalk just beyond the floodlight's reach. Daniel motioned them tight to the wall, advancing under the cover of darkness. Every corridor felt endless, the maze designed to swallow intruders whole. But Shadow wasn't lost. His nose traced invisible paths, his limp slowing him but never stopping him. Jensen whispered, "How does he know?" "Memory," Daniel said quietly. "Pain leaves better maps than paper ever could." They passed an open container, crates stacked neatly inside, fertilizer labels. Harmless on the surface, but the acrid chemical stench said otherwise. "We'll burn this yard to the ground," Claire muttered. "Not until no one else dies here," Daniel answered. Shadow stopped again, pressed his muzzle to dented steel, growl deepening. Then Daniel heard it. Voices. Close. Laughter. The clatter of weapons. He pressed a hand to Shadow's neck. "Easy. We'll get them." The shepherd's scars twitched, but his eyes burned forward. They crept to the end of the row. Ahead lay an open yard lit harshly, warehouse door ajar, yellow light spilling out. The kill zone. Shadow growled low, ears pinned. Daniel whispered, "That's where it begins." The whistle came sharp and sudden. Gunfire erupted from above, muzzle flashes strobing the catwalk. Bullets tore into the containers around them, sparks and steel screaming. "Down!" Daniel shoved Jensen behind cover. Claire rolled wide, pistol snapping up to return fire. One gunman yelped and vanished, but more rifles lit the catwalk, floodlights flaring as if the yard itself betrayed them. Daniel leaned out, fired 2 quick shots, ducked back as rounds stitched inches from his head. "Ambush! No kidding!" Claire barked, dropping another burst that forced a shooter back. Shadow's body coiled, muscles trembling with fury. With a guttural bark, he sprang. "Shadow, no!" Daniel shouted, but the shepherd was already gone, sprinting uneven but unstoppable across open ground. Bullets sparked at his heels. He clawed up crates, leapt onto the ladder, bounding with savage momentum. A vulture cursed, rifle lowering. Too late. Shadow slammed into him, jaws clamping, dragging him off balance. Man and dog crashed hard, rifle clattering away as Shadow shook until the man went limp. Daniel's heart clenched. Even wounded, Shadow fought like a soldier. Another gunman leveled his rifle at Daniel's position. Too fast, too close. The shot cracked. Cement shards exploded near Daniel's head. Then Shadow struck again, ramming the shooter's legs, dragging him down with a feral snarl. The man's weapon fired wildly into the night before clattering away. Daniel's chest heaved. Once again, Shadow had saved his life. "We're pinned," Claire shouted, reloading in cover. Jensen fired his shotgun, the blast shattering a floodlight. Darkness swallowed half the yard, giving them a sliver of relief. "Move!" Daniel barked, covering their advance with sharp, controlled fire. Shadow dropped back to Daniel's side, muzzle bloodied, limp worse now, but eyes blazing. Jensen stared at him in awe. He saved you. Daniel pressed a hand to the shepherd's neck, voice tight. He always does. They ducked behind another container, breaths ragged, boots pounded. More men regrouped. The warehouse door flared with light, leaders stepping into the open, flanked by guards. Long coats, cold eyes, the architects of 5 years of pain. Take them alive if you can, one called, but don't waste time. Shadow's snarl rumbled low, his body trembling but unyielding. Then a voice cut through the night, small, trembling, but fierce. You're not alone. Daniel froze. His blood went cold. Noah? The boy stepped into the edge of the floodlight, teddy bear in one hand, flashlight in the other. His chest heaved, but his chin was high. Claire swore. He followed us. Noah, get back, Daniel hissed. But the boy lifted the flashlight, shining it at Shadow. His voice cracked but carried, You're not alone. Do you hear me? You've never been alone. Shadow's ears pricked. His gaze locked on Noah. Go, Shadow! The boy shouted again, voice echoing through the steel canyon. Go! The shepherd surged forward, limp forgotten, every scar blazing with purpose. He barreled across open ground, bullets sparking around him, and launched onto the pallets. Claws tore grooves in wood as he leapt high, colliding with the last gunman on the catwalk. The rifle spun away. The man screamed as Shadow dragged him down, teeth clamped, fury unleashed. When it ended, the shepherd stood panting, chest heaving, eyes bright with triumph. Daniel's throat tightened. He'd seen men throw themselves into fire for brothers, but nothing compared to this battered dog answering a child's call. Gunfire slowed. Claire's shots cracked sharp and clean, Jensen's blasts shattering another floodlight. Guards faltered, their formation breaking. Daniel pressed forward, Shadow limping back to his side, blood streaking his flank, but resolve unbroken. Together they advanced. The syndicate leaders tried to retreat into the warehouse, but Claire's bullet shattered the lock, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Trapped. Within minutes, the yard was theirs. The last of the guards dropped their weapons or fled. Daniel stood over the bound leaders, chest heaving, Glock steady. It ends here. Behind him, Noah ran to Shadow, falling to his knees, arms around the shepherd's neck. You did it. I knew you could. Shadow pressed his muzzle into the boy's shoulder, tail giving the faintest wag before his eyes closed, exhausted but at peace. Daniel lowered his weapon, watching them, boy and dog, bound by something stronger than fear, stronger than pain, stronger than men who thought they owned the night. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the weight ease. They had won. But as the floodlights flickered, his mind tightened like a fist. Because one name was missing from the battlefield. Paul Miller. The courthouse loomed over Oak Ridge like a gray sentinel, its stone walls etched with decades of judgment. Crowds pressed against the steps, murmuring with a mixture of anger and hope. After years of whispers and fear, the black vultures were finally on trial. And at the center of it all sat Sergeant Paul Miller, the man who had once trained Daniel, who had betrayed him, who now faced a reckoning. Daniel climbed the steps with Shadow at his side. The shepherd was cleaned and brushed, but his scars were still visible, each mark a testament to what he had endured. Noah clutched Daniel's hand tightly, the boy's fingers small but firm, his eyes wide with determination. Inside, the courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. The air hummed with tension as the judge, silver-haired and stern, called the proceedings to order. The evidence table was crowded. Ledgers, photographs, bank records, and the rust-pitted steel box Shadow had helped uncover at the docks. Amelia testified first. Her voice trembled as she described the night Shadow returned, the boy's courage, and the relentless pursuit of the vultures. When she spoke of Shadow saving Daniel's life, the courtroom stirred. A collective breath caught. For once, courage wasn't just an abstract idea. It was alive, furred, and scarred, lying at Daniel's feet. Then came the ledger. Daniel carried it to the stand, his grip iron tight. He spoke plainly. Names, dates, shipments, payoffs. Each page was a blade slicing through Oak Ridge's illusion of safety. And when he read Paul Miller's name aloud, tied directly to the syndicate's bloodiest operations, the room erupted in gasps. Miller's face was stone, but the mask had cracked. His defense attorney barked objections, but the judge's gavel silenced him. The evidence was irrefutable. Betrayal had a name, and it belonged to the man who once swore to protect them. One by one, survivors of the vultures' violence testified. Their words painted a tapestry of fear and stolen years, but woven through it was hope. The dog who had returned, the boy who had refused to let him fall, the man who had dragged their truth into the light. The jury deliberated for only hours. When the foreperson stood, the room held its breath. Guilty, the verdict rang, on all counts. A collective exhale swept the courtroom. Some wept, others clasped hands. Daniel felt Shadow nudge his knee, the dog's amber eyes steady, tail giving one faint wag as if to say, "It's over." Noah whispered fiercely, "We did it. Shadow did it." Daniel pulled him close. "No, we did it together." Weeks later, Oak Ridge gathered in the town square. The late afternoon sun painted the rooftops in gold as flags rippled in the breeze. Children perched on parents' shoulders. Shopkeepers left doors wide open. For the first time in years, fear was not the undercurrent of the town. It was anticipation. At the square's center, draped in velvet cloth, stood the bronze statue. Daniel stood nearby, Shadow sitting tall at his side. Noah perched on Daniel's shoulders, eyes wide with pride. When the mayor spoke, her voice carried over the crowd. "Today, we honor a hero unlike any other. Shadow reminded us what loyalty looks like, what courage demands. He saved lives, and he reminded us how to live." The cloth was swept away. Gasps filled the square. The statue gleamed in sunlight. Shadow captured in perfect detail, stance strong, head alert, and the bent ear immortalized in bronze. It wasn't just art, it was a memory made eternal. Applause erupted. Some cheered, some cried. Children pointed wide-eyed and whispered his name. Noah scrambled down and ran to the base of the statue. He traced the sculpted fur with his small hand, voice trembling. "That's him. That's Shadow." The shepherd tilted his head, ears flicking, as if even he understood the likeness staring back. Amelia joined them, placing a hand on Noah's shoulder. "You did good, kid. You reminded us what it means to trust." Jensen and Claire stood nearby, their hardened expressions softening as they nodded toward the shepherd. "He earned every bit of this," Jensen said. Claire only murmured, "More than we'll ever know." The mayor closed with a single truth. Shadow's loyalty will outlast all of us. Today, Oak Ridge remembers not just a dog, but the courage he gave us all. Flowers piled at the statue's base. The square buzzed with joy, with release, with pride. Yet amidst the cheers, Daniel's gaze drifted to Noah and Shadow, the boy tracing the bronze ear, the dog's muzzle pressed against his shoulder. For all the public honor, the real victory was quieter. They had made it through, together. The next morning the town was hushed again, sunlight spilling softly over cobblestones. The bronze statue caught the first rays, bent ear shining like a beacon. Daniel stood there with Shadow and Noah, both of them unusually solemn. The courthouse doors stood open once more, but today was different. Inside, a kind-faced judge smiled as Noah approached. "Today, we begin a new chapter," she said warmly. "Noah, are you ready to be part of this family?" The boy's voice shook but didn't falter. "Yes." He glanced at Daniel, then at Shadow. The shepherd barked once, low and approving, tail brushing the floor. A few signatures. A few nods. The judge's voice final and kind. "By my authority, Noah, you are now officially part of Daniel's family. May you find safety, love, and the freedom to grow together." Tears slipped down Noah's cheeks as Daniel crouched beside him. "We're ready," Daniel said. "All of us." From his backpack, Noah pulled a collar, polished leather, engraved with bold letters, "Faithful until the end." With careful hands, he fastened it around Shadow's neck. The shepherd sniffed it, then pressed his muzzle into the boy's chest. "You're mine now," Noah whispered. "Forever." Daniel placed a steady hand on both of them, feeling something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Unguarded peace. They stepped back into the square, sunlight warming their faces. Families bustled around them, children played, and life, real, ordinary life, returned to Oak Ridge. Noah tugged Daniel's sleeve, voice soft. "Do you think he knows we love him?" Daniel knelt, meeting his eyes. "He knows." Shadow always knows. The shepherd settled between them, paw resting lightly against Daniel's knee, amber eyes reflecting trust and belonging. For a long while they stood together before the statue, three shadows stretching long across the cobblestones. The air smelled of spring and bread from the bakery, the world humming with possibility. Finally, Daniel straightened, resting his hand on Noah's shoulder. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." Noah's smile was radiant, the word home tasting new and precious on his lips. Shadow rose, ears alert, tail flicking once in quiet affirmation. And as they walked away from the statue, from the courthouse, from the weight of the past, Daniel realized the truth he had carried all along. Some battles were fought with guns, some with words, but the most important were fought with loyalty that never bent, love that never broke, and a dog whose heart had saved them all. Watching Shadow's journey reminds us of something timeless, the unwavering loyalty and love that German shepherds, and dogs in general, bring into our lives. They sense our fears, celebrate our joys, and remain by our side even when the world feels uncertain. Through their eyes, we're reminded that connection isn't just about words. It's about trust, presence, and the quiet moments that speak louder than anything else. Seeing how Shadow, Daniel, and Noah built a family from trust and shared experiences makes it clear. The bonds we share with our dogs aren't incidental. They're profound, life-changing, and endlessly rewarding. They teach us patience, empathy, and the courage to love without hesitation. If you've ever wondered how to deepen your connection with your own dog, there are resources that gently guide you in understanding them better, respecting their instincts, and communicating in ways that strengthen that special bond. I've found one such guide that feels more like a conversation with a caring friend than a lesson, and it's made a real difference for many families and their four-legged companions. Because at the end of the day, every tail wag, every nuzzle, and every quiet glance is a reminder that love and loyalty are always worth cherishing.